Talavao, thank you so much for taking time to come and talk with us today. Look, a lot of listeners, readers, etc. will be interested to know a little bit more about you. Can you give me a little bit of a sense of your family, where you came from and where you live and all that sort of stuff?
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here. So my name is Talavao Ngata. You can call me, lots of people call me Tala, and I actually like to think that that pays homage to my Samoan side. But I was born and raised here in Aotearoa, born in Tāmaki, to Tongan parents who migrated here during the late 70s, early 80s. I am the middle child of 5, stuck in the middle, 2 very funny older sisters and 2 very funny little brothers as well, so stuck in between that. But yeah, that's my whānau. I live with my partner and we're expecting a little baby very soon in December, so.
Could you tell us what degree you studied and where you did that, and what was that about?
Yeah, it's been a while now, but I did a Bachelor of Arts, a BA in Social Sciences and Conflict Resolution. I thought I wanted to be a mediator at some point, probably because I was the middle child, and then I moved on and then I did a Masters of Human Rights, because I was quite interested in children's rights in particular.
Both very relevant to the work that you're doing now, though, actually.
In housing, yes, yeah, I think so. And I probably might revisit the human rights angle for housing, yeah.
I think it's really interesting that was your study, because as Community Housing Aotearoa, one of our foundation principles is the right to a decent home.
Yes, yeah.
And of course that impacts everybody, but especially children.
So that's why I thought this was the perfect fit. And then you've got that Pacific kind of angle.
Tell me about your career so far. Where did you start out with your working life?
I started working in the Methodist Church, actually, just as doing admin for the Manurewa Methodist Church, which was really cool while I was studying. So it was really fun to sort of see the insides of what happens in the church and that kind of stuff. And then I moved into libraries, actually, with Auckland Council, and I was still studying, right, during this time, working towards social sciences, conflict resolution kind of degree. But I loved the libraries because it was very community focused, and it kind of brought me back to the real world while I was still studying all these things. And then from then I went into policy after I graduated and stayed with Auckland Council in the policy, community and social policy space, working on sort of thriving communities policy, but also youth I'm Auckland policy as well. So policy development, that was kind of what I was up to. And then I also worked with some sort of bylaw kind of stuff. So the signage bylaw, which was really riveting, but it was a really good experience, just early policy career kind of stuff. And then from there I moved into the youth space, working in community and social innovation, which was the sort of the Southern Initiative at Auckland Council. I had some experience there. And then from there I was looking for sort of the next step, and that's when this sort of Pacific policy role came up with Community Housing Aotearoa. So then I decided to sort of go for it. I knew Amanda previously from the Auckland Council days, and she said it was a great organisation, it's in the community. So went for it, and here I am.
And tell me, in terms of policy, what is attractive about that from your perspective in terms of your career, and why does policy matter from your perspective?
I was always interested in sort of decision making and how it influenced sort of the normal things in life, but also the big things in life. And so it's funny because local council policy is often laughed at about, it's rates, rubbish and rats kind of thing. But if you think about it, it actually impacts sort of the dailiness. How often does your rubbish get picked up? They're thinking about changing it recently. Sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant.
No, that's good.
I was always interested sort of how sort of words impacted, and policy can be seen as a bunch of words, but there's sort of meaning behind it. And so I was really drawn to sort of how we can interested in sort of how policy impacted the dailiness of people's lives. So that was what drew me to wanting to work in policy. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, through obviously, you've talked about the church and then you've talked about your whakapapa in terms of your Pacific people's origins and community. What do you see as the big challenges for our communities, and what difference could we make now that you're in a position within the housing policy realm? What are some of the big things that you think are the challenges and opportunities for people in terms of improved outcomes in their daily life?
Yeah, I mean, the importance of a home has always been forefront for me. And I grew up in a very loving home, but I also realized later, reflecting on sort of the home that we made here in Aotearoa, how that kind of experience was different to maybe other cultures and stuff. And that's just the way Pacific people lived. Like the garage wasn't seen as a place for the car kind of thing, or it was seen as a space for spirituality maybe, or a space for having a sleep, or a space of gathering. And so, yeah, the importance of that, I think, wasn't reflected or isn't reflected. And there are sort of harmful things that might come from that. Have always reflected on my experience growing up in Aotearoa, and sort of how that might not be the same experience for a lot of people.
And what are you observing in your community with the current, we're having a tough time at the moment in New Zealand. The employment market is depressed. It's hard to get work. Cost of living is high. What are the sorts of things that are being discussed with you as challenges for our communities, particularly given here in Tamaki, we're the largest Pacific people city in the world? What are some of the things you're hearing and seeing in your community?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about how sort of the cracks in what used to be our safety net are starting to appear a lot more nowadays. The pressures of the economic sort of unease is starting to sort of crack into very strong institutions that Pacific people have sort of nurtured and fostered since sort of migrating here. So I think, yeah, we've been talking a lot about sort of how do we support the strengthening of those cultural institutions like the family, like the church, and how that impacts when cost of living is increasing. What's the impact of increased cost of living? What's the impact of increased housing, in particular, housing costs, on that? And I guess it's a reflection of sort of the resilience of Pacific people, but why do they need to be so resilient in the face of these sort of challenges? So, yeah, we've been looking at sort of how do we strengthen those cultural, I guess, capital.
Yes.
But sort of bringing that together with New Zealand society. So, and we've been reflecting on the chip sector in particular and how sort of it can mesh and work together with Pacific cultural capital, this kind of concept of cultural capital. And then in the chip space, sort of churches have been quite a big thing, and how can they be sort of have a role in supporting housing aspirations for Pacific people. So we've been working a lot with sort of solutions-based in responding to these sort of issues or cracks in Pacific culture.
And any examples that stand out for you in your mind of some things that are working really well?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot with churches, of course, and what their role could be. And that's a long conversation to have, but a lot of them are coming around to sort of thinking about what their role could be. We are seeing sort of a relationship being built between iwi and Pacific communities down in CPC Porirua. And, how can more of that sort of happen? What innovation can come from nurturing those sort of kinship relationships that we've had for generations. And then also in just the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream ship sector, we've got Pacific people, talented Pacific people who are working within those organizations who bring a specific way of looking and living to that organization, which enriches their ability to sort of respond to Pacific communities and the needs out there. So yeah, there's different sort of innovations happening around. It's about sort of getting policy on board with that kind of innovation to encourage it more, to fund it more. But then also building the capability from the ground up with our communities, which I think is kind of the role that we've been playing as CHARS, is supporting that sort of groundwork to be ready for when the time comes, for when the environment is ready for it. But sort of, yeah, that's been the role that we've been playing. Yeah.
Nice. Now, some of our listeners and viewers will be interested to hear. I'll just ask your thoughts on culturally appropriate design. You've mentioned earlier the different use, for example, of garages. What are some of the key components that you would highlight for people who perhaps are not familiar with the specific cultural needs for Pacific peoples in terms of housing design and the way perhaps communities are organised? One example in mind recently was Penina, for example, blessing some new homes, and the arrangement was really interesting for me to see, because it had clearly been thought about in terms of the way Pacific families interrelate.
I have been thinking about this quite a lot. And it's funny because I think we're living in a time of a lot of change, generational change even, within the Pacific community. So I know that a lot of our older generation, not older, but sort of our first migration, kind of first generation, have this idea of multi-generational living, which of course is something I think we should encourage for all, living multi-generationally, generationally. There's so many benefits, great benefits that come from that, but also recognizing that young Pacific people may have different ways, may want to live differently, and are influenced because they've grown up here in Aotearoa and may not want the same thing anymore. So vertical living might be something that they might prefer. Home ownership might not be a dream for them. They might want just secure, affordable, long-term sort of rental, and they might want to just have options, different kind of options that are different from what our sort of older generations, our parents wanted. So yeah, I think there's no one way to design a house for a Pacific family, but having different design options, having the option for multi-generational living, I think is really important. I'm not a designer myself, but I know that there's not just one way of looking at what a Pacific home looks like. Yeah.
And interesting to hear you, earlier you mentioned you and your partner, have you moved into a home of your own recently?
Yes.
Right.
Now we're lucky though, his family bought a second home a very long time ago, so they needed some renters and we moved in to do that. So we're very lucky and very fortunate to have our own space. But we know that sort of we do want to maybe move into a proper rental. I don't know what the plan is, but we're very fortunate for the foresight of his parents to have bought another home and yeah.
Tell me, as you look to the future, given you're in the next few months going to have a child, what's the future you hope for yourselves, your family, your children as we look forward, in terms of, particularly, I think, being here in Tamaki, in one of the largest Pacific cities in the world, and what does that look like for you if it fills your heart with joy in terms of the sort of environment that you'll live in?
Oh, just a stable, secure home for me and for our child is what I've wanted, and also closeness to family. So I mean, I might be of the younger generation that kind of needs space, but I still need sort of a connection to family. So I've always imagined living next door to my parents, kind of thing, or just in the next neighborhood. But I do recognize and appreciate the idea or the concept of distance, but nurturing that distance, right? But yeah, it's exciting thinking about sort of building a new family, and sort of housing has been forefront of my mind, especially in Auckland, where it's extremely expensive to live here. But yeah, just a safe, secure home, near good facilities, just the basics of what you'd want, and closeness to family and community for sure.
Yeah, nice. Now, Tala, if because you're kind of leading on Pacific People's policy within community housing Aotearoa, if you had a magic policy wand and you could write some really substantial policy that would change things for the better, have you got a couple of things that are top of mind for you that would really make the housing system more responsive to the needs of people?
Yes. Oh gosh.
I know it's hard when you have a magic power, right?
But yeah. If there was one thing, I would whale moenga, what they did with whale moenga.
Can you expand on that so people understand about that? Because
it was a housing strategy from the Ministry of Pacific Peoples in collaboration with HUD and KO, actually. Good idea in principle, and a good policy, a good strategic vision for what Pacific housing, or what good outcomes for Pacific peoples in housing could look like. I would want a revamp of that, included with targeted funding to achieve those outcomes. But that strategy would need to work with us in the community, built by them, and then funded. And the funding would mainly be around capability building, I think, especially in the chip sector, where I think we could do the most good, especially with churches. There's so much potential there. I think it's not given enough attention, how we could build and this is where this idea of cultural capital, which exists in the Pacific communities, how do we strengthen that cultural capital to be able to deliver in terms of housing outcomes? And I think some capital could...
always helps, doesn't it?
Yes, of course, yeah.
When you talk about that policy, it's really interesting space in the New Zealand context, particularly because you mentioned earlier the Methodist Church, which is one of the largest churches in New Zealand. A number of churches have substantial land holdings. What do you think? Do you think people are afraid of that's stopping them from really engaging in supporting the supply of more new affordable housing?
I can see it when we talk to members of the church. They of course, in principle, they'll say, of course we want social affordable, but they probably don't understand the workings of within the church, and so are probably afraid of maybe letting go of what they have, and or seeing it as something for the wider public. I don't know. I think there's maybe a perception thing within the church around what's allowed, what's able to be done, and and I think the loss of it might feel like the loss of something to the church.
Yes.
Which maybe is a cause for reflection on the role of the church and the history of the church as well. So, but that's what I find with churches. Now with Pacific churches, or even with the mainstream Methodist churches, you see a lot of them are browning, quote unquote browning. So you're seeing a lot of Pacific faces coming up in the church, and sort of maybe that will bring a new tide of change, for the better, for the worse, maybe a clash of sort of cultures. But you can see that change happening, and I think if we sort of support good conversations with the church, especially around housing, especially if that is an aspiration that they want to look into.
Seems to be a growing movement.
Yes, I think so.
Not just in the Pacific people's context, but also in the Māori context and indeed Pākehā circles.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time we're seeing a fear of loss of land, a fear of loss of control. But actually there's some real great innovations now in terms of products which don't require the sale of the land.
Yes,
and so perhaps there's a way through there.
Meet somewhere. Yeah.
So again, we're kind of back to policy, aren't we, in a way?
Yes, and how it impacts. Yeah.
Do you feel you have the permission, I suppose is one word, to write policy? Or how does it feel from a community housing perspective? Are you looking to the government to do that, or local government, or where do you think is the best place for that to come from? That future policy that's going to make the housing system work better for all our people, especially our low income whānau.
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I feel like sometimes we're pointing the finger at the government to sort of do it, and then they're asking us, how do we do it? And it's kind of a bit of a back and forth. And then I think the community could do a better job at maybe being specific about what we want and being clear about what it is, what that looks like as well. And then on the other hand, I think the government or policymakers could do a better job at listening and hearing properly, and maybe not being thwarted by sort of political kind of issues. So it's a kind of a two-way thing that I see might work best. But I do think within our control, within our span of control, as CHA and as the chip sector, we could do a whole lot better, maybe being very clear about what those sort of policy asks are, for sure, especially in the Pacific space, because I think Pacific people, we think very broadly about things, but we could totally be a bit more specific about what it is we want. Yeah.
Brilliant. Hey, Tala, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. I really appreciate you sharing a little bit about your work and your life. Really great to spend some time with you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, team.